And we'll talk a little bit about a few other factors that are affecting cognitive development. So the effect of culture, for example. Humans are a product of their culture as much as culture is a product of them. So humans learn basic social skills such as language, and they develop more complex mental capabilities based on these building blocks. So one example of this is the phenomenon known as linguistic relativity. And I'm sure most people have heard this in a couple of different names, but it's the same thing, wherein an individual's language directly affects or constrains their way of thinking. So language can even affect an individual's perception. It has been proven in some studies that speakers of languages that categorize colors more specifically are able to perceive those colors better than speakers of languages that lack the same vocabulary. So I put this picture of blue over here. I believe one of the studies, or the most popular study, was done in Russian because, if I'm not mistaken, there are multiple words in Russian that mean blue. They're different shades of blue and they have actual names, whereas a couple of other languages don't have multiple words for different shades of blue. So even in English, for example, we mostly just use the word blue, but that can describe a spectrum of different colors. So what this theory is saying is that our language and our vocabulary directly affects the way we think and the way we can perceive this. If there are more words that describe different shades of blue in our language, we are actually more likely to be able to perceive and recognize that as a different color compared to someone who speaks a different language. So culture definitely has an effect on, our cognition and our perception. Aging, of course, also has an effect on cognition. Cognition doesn't remain stable throughout an individual's entire life. Piaget has 4 stages, and the last one, of course, is formal operational, which is 12 and above, but it doesn't remain stable until death, usually, depending on how old the person lives. It's usually at about the age of 60, most humans start to experience some degree of cognitive decline. And for a lot of people, it's very slow and very steady cognitive decline. But, there are other cases in terms of illness, Alzheimer's, where stuff like dementia can form. But interestingly, certain cognitive abilities are more affected by old age than others. So for example, recall becomes increasingly impaired, but recognition remains relatively stable. So recall is the ability to recall something from memory completely without a cue. So recognition is the ability to recognize something and identify it when you are presented with the cue, and recall, you have to be able to pull that from your long-term memory without the cue. So recall becomes increasingly impaired, but recognition, from the studies, seems like it actually remains relatively stable with age. Information processing abilities are also slowed in older adults. So anything having to do with processing any type of information. So it may take them longer to speak, it may take them longer to react, and it's just the natural process of aging. So heredity versus environment, or nature versus nurture. So nature and nurture work together to mold an individual's cognitive profile. In other words, people are born with genetic predispositions, but their social and cultural interactions encourage or discourage the formation of these certain mental capabilities. So genetic predisposition means something may be more likely to happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. It's a combination of genetic and environmental factors that actually mold that final product. So for example, if an adopted child whose birth parents are both statisticians finds himself in an underfunded school district with absentee parents, he may never develop the mathematical abilities of his birth parents. So if both of his parents are very good at math, we may be able to assume that they do have a genetic predisposition to math, to enjoy it. They have higher cognitive functioning. And there's a good chance that if both of them have that, then they would pass that genetic predisposition down to their child. However, if this child were adopted, or if the child were placed in foster care, was in an underfunded school district where he wasn't getting the right access to resources to improve this ability while he was growing, he may never develop those mathematical abilities. So he has the genetic predisposition to it, but the environmental factors aren't there. So it's a constraint. And similarly, a child who grows up in a wealthy school district and has access to private tutoring may still struggle with math because of a genetic predisposition. So then again, you could do everything right. You can have parents that hire private tutors, they go to a great school district, they're constantly emphasizing the importance of math in the child's life. Some children are just not going to get it because of a genetic predisposition. So it's a combination of both factors that form the final product. We also have biology, of course, that affects cognition. And when we say biology, we're talking specifically about the actual physical structure, the physical anatomy and physiology. So of course, the physical structure and health of our brains directly affect our cognitive and perceptive abilities. There is a condition known as agnosia, which is an inability to recognize objects despite sensory input being impaired. And this can often be explained by damage to the occipital and parietal lobe, for example. So we do know of conditions that are directly a cause, or I'm sorry, that are directly an effect of maybe lesions or scarring on specific parts of the brain. It's been thoroughly studied, especially with different agnosias. They can induce, scientists can induce lesions on the brain, temporary lesions even, just to see what abilities are impaired with it. So for example, the frontal lobe is involved in planning and organizing and inhibiting impulses, while the amygdala and the rest of the limbic system control emotional arousal, alertness, and motivation. So the interaction between all of the physical regions of the brain give rise to our cognitive processes. So we're using multiple parts of our brain all the time. So for example, if we're using the frontal lobe in planning and we are trying to figure out the best way to get across a bridge, say, we're going to maybe look at the bridge, see where its weak spots are and say, okay, don't jump there, don't jump there. Our amygdala is activating as well, and it's saying, do not jump there, that's scary, you could fall. So it really is a conglomerate of different parts of the brain that all work together that really give rise to all of our cognitive processes. Okay, so we're going to talk now about some theories of intelligence. We'll start with the early ones, and then we will, make our way to modern day. So the concept of intelligence is a human creation. So just keep that in mind as we are studying all of this, because a lot of different people have a lot of different definitions for what intelligence is or how to define it. One formal definition lists it as the ability to solve problems and use knowledge or experience to adapt to new situations. So throughout the 19th and 20th century, psychologists have come up with differing theories on how to describe or quantify intelligence. And you can see they sort of jump off, they're sort of stepping stones from one theory to the next. You can sort of see how it changes throughout the 19th and 20th century. But different psychologists, even still to this day, will have very different definitions of what intelligence actually what it is, because it is a social construct. So even if you look at these early theories of intelligence, they were more focused on trying to find and quantify this singular number known as general intelligence, whereas a lot of the theories today have it split into different, into different sections. They're very multifaceted today compared to the ones that were in the 18 and 1900s. So in the mid 1800s, Francis Galton proposed the theory of general intelligence. In this theory, Galton thought that there was one general form of intelligence and that it was heavily determined by genetics. So he basically thought that intelligence was a cognitive process, just like anything else that we would do. We use language, we have intelligence, we run, we walk. He wasn't really interested in figuring out what intelligence was, where it came from. He was just trying to figure out pretty much how to quantify it, or if it were possible to quantify it. And there were a lot of flaws in his methodology, and there are a lot of implications even to this day of some of his work. So for example, he did not take into consideration environmental factors when determining intelligence, and he operationally defined intelligence as reaction time. So what that means is when he was conducting his experiment, you have to operationally define all of your variables. So that means giving a quantitative value to define a specific variable. So he was trying to measure intelligence, and he said, how can I quantitatively measure intelligence? And he thought that reaction time was the best possible way to determine an individual's intelligence, which to today's measures is laughable, but that's the way he was thinking about it. So Francis Galton's his theory greatly contributed to the rise of eugenics as well, and the categorization and ranking of races by genetic superiority, which again, to today's standards, is just completely ridiculous and just a heinous thing to even think about. But that was his thought process, and a lot of his works were inaccurately cited in a lot of eugenics campaigns, a lot of genocides, a lot of atrocities that went on during immigration in the 19th century. So he has a lot of lasting cultural implications. It's very interesting to read on. It explains a lot, actually. So moving forward from that, though, Alfred Binet sought to devise a way to test the intelligence of French school children in the early 1900s to determine which children needed special education. So Galton's his motivations weren't the greatest, but it seemed like Alfred Binet's motivations were a little bit better. He was just trying to quantify intelligence to see how they could better help school children and try to decide which school children actually needed special education. So his test was later revised by a psychologist at Stanford University, and it became known as the Stanford Binet test. And that was more commonly known as the intelligence quotient test, or the IQ test. And there are still, even to this day, there is still a lot of IQ tests that you can take. Generally, they are thought not to be the most accurate way to measure intelligence because, again, what really is intelligence? But people do use them in practice. You just take them with a grain of salt and you have to understand what they're telling you. Charles Spearman was another psychologist in the early 1900s who actually coined the term general intelligence. And he, again, thought that there was a singular quantifiable variable that he referred to as Spearman's G. So Spearman, like Binet, yes, believed that he could be quantified by testing. Okay, so now we're starting to deviate a little bit away from that that idea that there is a general intelligence. So as psychologists began to understand the shortcomings of these theories of general intelligence in the early 20th century, they began to devise more complex theories to explain it. Because again, they were looking at all of these theories and they were seeing so many problems with it. So for example, with Galton's theory, if we say took an immigrant from a lower socioeconomic status and gave them the same exact test that was developed in America, we gave that test to someone who was from the upper class of America, that person in the upper class is going to do a lot better than someone who has absolutely no cultural context and has absolutely no schooling to do it. So it's just not a good way to measure intelligence. Raymond Cattell, however, came up with a model that splits intelligence into two types. So fluid intelligence, GF, and crystallized intelligence, GC. So fluid intelligence describes our ability to think quickly and solve novel problems. So that's basically our critical thinking skills, our on-the-fly thinking, our ability to think about that. So crystallized intelligence describes our ability to recall and apply already learned knowledge. And his theory is also very interesting, and it's still used today as well, especially in school. If you're ever interested, in school, just sort of the theories that they use to teach. One of the biggest debates is the importance between aptitude and achievement. So aptitude meaning how your ability to learn new information, and achievement means your ability to apply past information to new problems. So that sounds pretty familiar to me. Fluid intelligence would be sort of parallel to aptitude, and crystallized intelligence would sort of be parallel to achievement. Super interesting stuff, I think. And this brings us to the present, Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So in the late 20th century, Howard Gardner proposed his theory of multiple intelligences. So in it, he described intelligence as being made up of 8 modalities. So we went from 1G to 2, and then Gardner split it up and said, no, there are 8 modalities. There are different ways in which people can be intelligent. Because again, we don't really have a specific definition for what intelligence is. So Howard Gardner, was thinking more along the lines of intelligence is a proficiency in a certain skill. So if we break it down to the most basic skills, what facets, what modalities can humans be intelligent with? So he broke them up, and his 8 modalities were logical, linguistic, spatial, musical, kinesthetic, natural, intrapersonal, and interpersonal. So intrapersonal is also sometimes known as emotional intelligence, and interpersonal is also known as social intelligence. So Gardner's theory is still employed today by some teachers and caregivers, and a lot of people use it, especially when they're coming up with caretaking plans for growing children. And the theory revitalized a lot of interest in social and emotional intelligence in the late 1990s. Because again, that was something that was not studied. That was something that was not even considered in the early 1900s and the late 1800s.